So in this presentation, we're going to talk about how to measure quality, now that we know that quality is really important for the produce that we're producing. So first of all, we'll talk about color. So color can be measured in a variety of different ways. Again, we can look at it just visually and make an assessment of the color. We can also try to match the color to different color charts. So here you can see some different color charts. This one is for sweet cherry. This one is for pink lady apples. This one here is for peaches and nectarines to measure the background color. So you can take your product, say this apple, if we wanted to match it up to the color chart, this has nice circles behind it, so we can match it up like this and say, okay, we could say, in this case, this is described as an R5, so that's on this particular color chart. If we said that was the color of the apples we had and we communicated with people and they also had the same chart, then they would know what color we were talking about. These color charts here were produced by the California Department of Food and Ag, and they used to be used a lot for maturity standards for peaches and nectarines. But they can still be used to describe different stages of maturity or quality of fruit. So matching to a color chart is a really simple way of assessing the quality. Here's another one for walnuts to show the kernel color of different walnuts. In the laboratory and in more sophisticated quality control labs, we'll oftentimes use a piece of equipment that uses optical light. So it shines light through the product, and the light is either reflected or transmitted, and that tells us something about the color. And then, of course, in the lab, we can also do a chemical analysis of the actual pigments that make up the color. But in the industry, matching the colors to charts is really the most common way of assessing the color. Here's an example of a chart used for sweet cherries that shows different colors of sweet cherry from red to dark mahogany. And here for papayas, this is a chart that was put together to assess different stages of ripeness, which are based on not only the external color of the papaya, but the internal color as well. And so there again, with that chart, you could talk about different stages, and others who had the chart would understand what you were talking about. This is the optical instrument, the Minolta colorimeter, that's often used in the laboratory to very accurately assess the color and measure slight changes in color. Again, it's probably more sophisticated than what most industry groups would need to use, but it's very useful in the laboratory. So how about measuring size? There's a variety of ways of doing this. Certainly in a packing house, there's all sorts of equipment that can measure the length and the weight and potentially the volume of products. But we also have some tools we can use when we're harvesting products or in more of a hands-on operation. We might want to use a tool like this that can be used to measure the size of a product. So for example, with this apple, if I wanted to figure out what was the diameter of this apple, I could use this ring, and so it tells me here that it's this particular size for this apple. These different tools are available from USDA. Here's a smaller one for smaller fruit. And then this one here is kind of handy, especially out in the field if you want to be able to measure diameters, but you don't want to go to all the trouble of putting the fruit inside. You can just easily slip that on there. If you're trying to have your harvesters pick fruit only of a certain size, you could send them out with a tool like this. They could also use a caliper like this to measure the diameter of the product, say for this plum, if you wanted to measure the diameter. You could also just use a simple paper chart like this and just as a guide and set your product on top and get an indication of whether it should be assessed as an extra small, a medium, or an extra large, for example. So just a very simple chart in this case. So these are a collection, again, of all the different tools that can be used to measure size. Most of these are available through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In terms of assessing visible defects, there's a variety of ways to do this. I mean, certainly you can look at the product and say, yes, this has a defect, but maybe you want more information than that. Maybe you want to know how severe is that defect for some reason. And in that case, you may want to use a rating scale. Here's an example of a rating scale, two different rating scales. One was developed for cilantro to look at changes in leaf quality, particularly yellowing of the leaves. And then same here for collards. So this is a rating scale for yellowing of the collards as their post-harvest life degrades. So a scale like that can be very useful for describing the condition of the product as well. And we call a scale like this a hedonic scale. So generally it's a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 scale, where 1 is no damage. Then you go to slight damage, moderate, and severe. And so that's one way to assess the appearance quality of the product. And we can also assess the overall quality of the product. So if we took this potato, okay, and it has some cuts and whatnot, but other than that, it's pretty solid. There's not really a lot of decay coming in yet. So on this particular scale, I would probably rate this potato as a good. So it has moderate defects, but it's still marketable. So you can either have a 1 to 9 scale, or you can use a 1 to 5. It's really according to your preference. But the higher number in the overall scoring system is for the best quality. And a score of, in the middle of the scale is for the limit of marketability. And then below that, you have the limit of usability. That means if you picked up, say you picked up this apple, it has some decay, you might decide to cut it in half and eat one half of it. That might be the limit of usability if you picked it up out of your refrigerator. But if you went to the market, probably you wouldn't buy this apple. So that would be a fair rating, possibly a very poor rating. Very poor is inedible. So that's for things that have no use for human consumption. So in terms of texture quality, again, there's lots of different ways that we describe the texture. And in some ways, it depends on the product. So for example, for apples, we want an apple to be crisp, not mealy or soft. But with a mango, we would want a mango to be creamy, not fibrous, right? So there's lots of different kinds of texture depending on the product. And so in terms of measuring texture quality, one of the most common ways is to use a penetrometer if you want to measure firmness or softness. So I'm going to show you how that works. So if we take this apple, we want to measure how firm it is. We can use a device like this. This is a handheld effigy penetrometer, and it can be used to measure the firmness of the fruit. Now, currently we have a 8mm tip on here. This smaller tip is actually useful for things like pears, and also peaches, plums, and nectarines. But for apples, convention is that we use this larger tip, this 11mm tip. So I'm going to put the 11mm tip on here. And then the next thing we need to do, okay, is to take some skin off of the surface of the apple. Okay, just a thin slice, so that we want to measure the texture of the flesh, not the skin. The skin can have a big influence if we leave it on there. So then we have this little tripod to help hold the fruit still. You don't have to have that. You can just hold it in your hand. And in fact, you don't have to have this fancy stand. The stand is nice because it makes it easier to control the process. But you can just do it by hand with the product against a table and press the penetrometer into it. But with the stand, you're going to slowly press it down into the product until you get to the line on the probe. And then what you see is that the dial has come up here, and it's saying we have, this is 5 kilograms of pressure. So the apple is pretty firm, and so then we can just reset the dial, and then we're ready to measure another piece of fruit. So that's how the penetrometer works, and again, it can be used handheld. It's best if you try to secure the piece of fruit against a surface and then press the probe into it. So that's very useful for a lot of different kinds of fruit and vegetables. There are also motorized units that can be purchased. These are relatively expensive, but it takes the human factor out of it. One of the things with the doing it by hand, and also with this drill press stand, is that if you do it very quickly, you can get a higher value than if you do it slowly and steadily. So the electronic unit takes the human element out of it, and it's a more reliable and consistent reading. It also collects the data in a computer for you. We can also measure firmness by compression. So I'm sure you've done this yourself. Just you take a plum and you want to see how firm it is. You squeeze it between your fingers, right? So you're giving it a slight compression. So that is also a great way to measure firmness or softness. And there are machines like the Firmtech shown in this picture that can measure that compression automatically. So it has a load cell, and it gently compresses the fruit, and then gives you a reading as to how much the fruit resisted that compression. So that's also very useful, and that Firmtech device is best for small round fruit because of the turntable device that is part of the unit. So it's great for blueberries, for cherry tomatoes, and for sweet cherries. So there's some other texture measurements we might want to make that are a little more challenging to measure. These are things like fibrousness or toughness, succulence or juiciness, mealiness, grittiness, oiliness. Now, some of these we can do in the laboratory by measuring chemical components, but in some cases they're best measured by sensory analysis. So what that means is that we're having people taste the products. So also flavor is another factor that's easiest to measure with sensory analysis. So if we want to know how sweet something is, or how astringent it is, or whether it has an off flavor, these are other characteristics that can be measured in the laboratory. We can use very sophisticated gas chromatographs to get very specific information about aroma volatiles or astringent compounds or off flavors. But sometimes sensory evaluation is more straightforward, and it can get you straight to what consumers prefer. In terms of measuring sweetness, one of the easiest ways to measure sweetness is by measuring soluble solids. And we use a device called a refractometer. So the refractometer shines light through, first you extract some juice from your product, then you shine light through it through a prism, and the light is refracted, and that's what gives you the soluble solids reading. So this can be done with a handheld device, just a simple portable device like this. And so you're going to put your juice on the glass slide, and then you can measure the soluble solids by looking through the eyepiece. So you can see on the diagram what it looks like when you look through that eyepiece. In more recent years, digital refractometers have become available, and they're just a little more expensive than the handheld device. And this digital refractometer is very quick and accurate. And here you just put a small drop of juice on the lens, press the button, and you get a reading. So it takes a little bit of that human element out of the measurement. So I'm going to show you real quick how to measure the soluble solids content. So if you have a piece of fruit, a round piece of fruit, one thing that's important to realize is that the soluble solids is not the same from the outside to the center of the fruit. And so generally when we take a sample, we want to cut through to the core of the fruit and take like a wedge. So you can see that we've removed a wedge from the fruit, so we have some sample from the center, but we're also going through to the outside of the fruit. And then we can take that and just chop it up a little bit. And then place it in some cheesecloth, take a few pieces. And then we can use just a simple garlic press. I think I've got too much in there. To get some juice. So if we turn on our little digital device, press the button, it shines the light through the sample, and it says we have 12.5% soluble solids. Some people call this reading Brix. That's very common in the produce industry. They hear this reading described as Brix. That's not actually accurate. When we measure fruit and vegetables, it has lots of other things in there, which is why we prefer the term soluble solids. But either one is fine because we know what we're talking about. So anyway, we have 12.5% soluble solids, and if we could also do the same with our handheld device here. A little bit of juice. And then you just hold it up to the light, and actually it's, yeah, about 12.5, very much the same. So same reading for both. So that's soluble solids. It's probably one of the most common measurements made that is related to the flavor of products. Now we might also be interested in measuring the acidity of the product. That's a lot more difficult to measure. We're able to do it in the lab, and there are a number of companies working on, digital devices like this. I would say at this point it's not quite as reliable as the soluble solids. So hopefully in the near future, something like that will become available, so stay tuned for that one. Okay, so I mentioned before sensory evaluation, that it's really a great tool for measuring some things that are hard to measure with simple techniques. So, we have our measurements for firmness that we talked about and the measurement for soluble solids, but if we want to get at the acidity or the fibrousness or the oiliness or some off flavor, feeding people samples is the easiest way to do that. And there's really two basic ways that can be done. One is to work with a small group of people who would be trained to be sensory experts, or at least somewhat of an expert on your product. So they would have some experience at tasting it and describing what they're tasting and feeling in their mouth. And so that's a descriptive panel is what we call that. And so they're basically, we oftentimes will find that we want people in kind of an isolated place where they're not influenced by other people or outside environment, so they can focus on just tasting the sample and giving an evaluation. You can see the woman sitting in the booth in the upper corner photo. That's a descriptive panel that she's participating in. Now the bottom photo shows a consumer tasting session. There you have lots and lots of consumers who come to taste your product. You want hundreds and hundreds of people to come, and generally you ask them some pretty simple questions about how well they like the product or which product they prefer. And that's a great way to get an idea of how well the flavor quality would satisfy consumers. And here's just a quick example of a score sheet that we might use. This one happens to be one from a consumer study where the sample is identified with a random number, and then we're asking some simple questions about the sweetness and other characteristics of the product. Generally, we also ask some information about the consumer so we know, how old they are, how much do they generally eat that product, which helps us to interpret the data going forward. So those are really some simple ways to measure the quality of your product. If you're interested in the produce quality rating scales, like the cilantro one that I showed, there is a publication available that has a range of different scales inside, and that's available through the Post-Harvest Technology Center. So thanks for your attention.